Hello and welcome to the Circular Economy Show. On this podcast, we often talk about the opportunities and the successes in a circular economy, but maybe we don't talk enough about the failures or the struggles that help us to get there. And over the next 4 episodes in a mini-series, we're going to be looking at why circular business models fail to scale. We've got 10 common pitfalls that have been identified through some research which has been brought together in a paper, and I'm delighted to be joined by Maddy and Ella, who have led the research on that. We're going to break it down into 4 episodes because there's so much information in there to explore. But let's get into it with part 1. Ella, could you recap very quickly on what we mean by circular business models?
So circular business models are about moving from the world in which there's a straight line from production to disposal towards models which are designed to keep products and materials in use for as long as possible and at their highest possible value. And ultimately, our goal with this is to decouple economic activity and economic growth from resource consumption. And so this might look like a resale model, using secondhand goods, selling them on again, or it could be rental,
repair, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's a huge amount of creativity involved in that and lots of opportunity, isn't there, Maddy? What about scaling that?
So much. So, there's so much noise and uncertainty for businesses at the moment, and it's really challenging. And one of the great things that circular business models can offer is competitive advantage. There's so many top line benefits. So we're thinking about things like driving new sources of revenue, attracting new types of customers, and then also increasing customer loyalty and satisfaction once you have got those new customers. And for the bottom line, we're thinking about things like cutting material costs, reducing risk of supply chain disruption, price volatility, supply gaps that we see a lot nowadays, from climate change effects and other things, political instability, and then also really just reducing the risk of future policy changes as well, all while helping our climate and biodiversity goals.
Yeah, addressing a lot of those issues. Something that we've heard Rachel Riley from Accenture talk about is this pilot purgatory that people get stuck in with circular business models. So what's holding people back from scaling these? Because you've talked about so many advantages that it has, but there must be something that's holding people back.
It's so true. I couldn't agree more. We're definitely in pilot purgatory. There's so many companies that have seen the advantage and really started to try out, pilots and smaller scale projects from startups to huge corporations. And they've been quite visible. But what we haven't really seen is that translate into large scale. So when we say scale in this paper, what we're really talking about is that sort of shift to circular business models being a dominant source of revenue for a company.
Right.
And eventually, hopefully replacing the linear side of their businesses. And while we're seeing a lot of momentum towards these pilots, we're just not seeing that sort of large scale takeover.
And then we're really focusing on the failure part here.
Yes.
It feels inevitable to me that there must be some level of failure, because with some of these organisations, you're asking them to really change the way they do business, aren't we?
Absolutely. And we're definitely not saying with this paper, don't fail. I mean, failure is such an important part of the innovation process. It's those sticky bits and the incremental steps along the way that really sort of generate the most fascinating learnings. I think what we're really calling for here is just more transparency on that process. It's so hard for people to learn from those collective experiences if we don't talk about them. So that's why we've really chosen to focus on that. And we're really in a unique position to do that. I mean, we convene this large business network and we have access to have conversations with so many pioneering businesses that are really sort of leading the charge on circular business models. So it felt really natural that we could have that conversation and really try and learn from the experiences that they're having.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the work that you did to get to this point. We're having 4 episodes exploring this, and I'm really glad that you're both here to talk us through that, because when you first approached me with this idea, I looked at the work you did and I thought there's so much in here, but there's no way that you can absorb all of that in one episode. So I'm really happy we're splitting it into 4. But tell us about the work that's supporting this, Maddy.
Yeah, so I guess the premise was to ask as many companies as possible about their experiences. We ended up speaking to 30 plus organizations in the network from a really broad range of industries, and types of business, also types of circular business model that they tried. And we've really tried to distill all of those learnings into the common things that we saw people struggling with that were sort of universal across those industry and business model contexts. And we've sort of clustered them into 4 key areas, and that's what we'll explore in these episodes.
So there are 10 pitfalls you've identified overall,
Exactly.
and then you've consolidated those into these 4 clusters.
Exactly.
We're going to take a cluster per episode.
We are.
Just to break it down a bit more.
Exactly. And what's really important to note as well is that one of the biggest things that we decided to focus on was internal barriers to scale. So there's obviously so many external factors that can affect a company going to scale with a circular business model. But when we were having these conversations, we realized that the most common things were the internal challenges. And so that was a bit more exciting to us. It's very much within the agency of a lot of practitioners to think about what they can control in the organizational setup of the project, or, what stakeholders they work with and how the project's organized. So those are the things that we really chose to focus on. And I was so surprised how excited people were to talk about this. I think that's been one of the most energizing experiences that I've had at EMF. It was, I guess, cathartic for people to talk about what's not working. And actually, there was no negativity there at all. It's really about what can we collectively learn to move forward. And it's really nice to be able to have those conversations. So yeah, I was really, really grateful to everyone that chose to speak to us, and really excited to be able to share this.
So Ella, what was that first cluster that you identified?
So the first thing was about thinking too small, how we categorized it, but it's essentially about mindset. So what we really want to achieve, as Maddy said, is that kind of transformative state in which circular business models are really kind of generating high volumes of revenue for these organizations. What we found, and it feels like a very obvious learning, but was by far and away perhaps the most common learning, is that whilst a lot of people kind of saw these business models as innovative and exciting, they weren't necessarily looking at how that plays forward. And those design decisions you make really early on can have a huge impact on whether you get to that kind of later state.
So let's dig into the pitfalls, Maddy. What was the first pitfall in that thinking too small category?
So pitfall 1 was lacking a plan of scale from the outset, and it's really what it says on the tin. This was, that common issue of so many companies just jumping at the opportunity to do a pilot for something, which is fantastic, and we love that momentum. But as Ella said, really lacking a future vision of what happens after that. And pilots generate some fantastic learnings, and we definitely saw that and heard that as a story. But what can happen is if you haven't got that vision for the longer term setup, the organizational setup, the stakeholders that are going to be involved internally, what departments are going to be where, what goals you're going to have, all those things, the learnings that you generate from a pilot can sometimes not actually translate very well when you try and go to scale. And I think that was the really sort of big sticking point here, was if you're going to use a pilot successfully to sort of help you on that approach to scale, it needs to really have a lot of those elements already in place. You need to have that vision from the outset for it to be effective.
And you said you spoke to 30 organisations. Ella, I wonder if you can give, because I'm sure people are listening or watching and nodding along to this with their experiences, but what did you hear when you were speaking to these organisations?
Well, one example in particular, we know that with delivering circular business models, partnerships can be really useful. We're looking at how there's quite a lot of change if you're moving from a pure sales model into, for example, a rental model. And we did speak to one organisation who chose to partner with an external delivery partner for the whole delivery of their pilot. Mm-hmm. And what they found was, they had great success. There was a real customer conversion, great margins, and it was definitely, it made the case internally for why they should invest more in this model. However, what they had done was design this whole model around delivering with that specific provider. Right. And when they brought that model in-house to scale it up across their different geographies, and in that kind of context of who they were as an organisation, they had to do things like change to a different product because they had to align with the premium brand they had. They had to use different geographic locations, and all of these things meant they lost the kind of customer excitement that they generated in that pilot, and they didn't have the learnings from kind of what had gone wrong, what had gone right, and how it had been amended in that pilot phase. And it was just fundamentally very different. And so they really lost that kind of momentum that they gained in the pilot, and unfortunately leadership then canned it.
That's such a shame, because there were all those learnings and they could have gone so much further. So Maddy, what's the solution to that? How do we avoid that happening in organisations?
I mean, ultimately be very, specific to the context of the organisation. But I think what we're really saying is overall, treating scale as the goal from day one is really what you want to be doing. Thinking about the stakeholders, the processes, the operational side of things, what that will look like in the future, and really almost building a roadmap backwards to try and get there. And it's really important that you have, buy-in along the way. So working with those people early on, and we'll talk a little bit more about partnerships in the fourth part of this series. But that's really one of the main things. I think also then really considering critically whether piloting is the right approach. I think for some business models, for all, there's probably going to be an element of viability and you want to check what's going to work and what isn't. But I think for some things, if you already have a direction set, piloting wasn't always the most effective way for organizations to get there. And actually, a longer term transition with that roadmap that we talked about, with actually sort of different testing and learning approaches along the way that maybe doesn't necessarily look like pilots, can sometimes be a better option. So thinking just really critically about the best way to get from A to B and what's the best way to do that in your organization.
And then it's a more holistic view than sort of putting it into that corner, which you have the risk of falling into pilot purgatory then. Absolutely.
And then, making sure that you've designed the partnerships to scale. I mean, Ella talked about that in the example. It's and that was a really common one that we heard. Mm-hmm. You've just got to make sure that those partnerships are set up in the right way. And if, you choose to pilot with one organization, that's totally fine, but have that as a deliberate choice and choose what those learnings and what important data and things like that you're going to get from the experience. And we'll talk a little bit more to that in the last episode.
Yeah. Great. So Maddy, tell us about pitfall number 2.
So pitfall number 2 is not aligning with the existing business strategy. So again, this sounds like quite an obvious thing. But I think what we commonly see is that because circularity has been born out of many sort of sustainability departments and a lot of organizations, it tends to get very narrowed into being a sustainability only initiative. Mm-hmm. And that means that we tend to think about it in terms of our climate goals or our sustainability goals, but actually not in how it relates to the rest of the business. We were saying earlier in the introduction, there's so many fantastic ways that circular business models can enhance what a business is doing. And actually so many of those just relate to the core strategies and goals that an organization has. So it's much more powerful to be linking your circular business model goal to something that already exists in the business. I think the most common problem that we saw here is people creating circular business models as a separate strategic objective in their own right. And the problem
sort of like doing it for the sake of doing it.
Exactly. And the problem is there's just too much noise at the moment and too many other priorities that are coming up. So really it's about linking to what you're already doing, the core parts of your identity that make you sort of, strong as a business, and thinking about the ways that circular business models can aid those existing strategies.
Yeah. And staying focused on what your business actually is.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Ella, paint us that picture. What examples did you see of this in the organisations you surveyed?
Again, many, but particularly thought was a really interesting example was actually just the misconception around sustainability can be a real block. So we saw with an electronics company, it's a premium, high quality goods is what they produce. And their sustainability team brought forward this project, which was about introducing recycled content into their products and into their supply chain. And they really made the sell around compliance and sustainability and waste reduction, which of course are really important. But they kind of failed to bring forward the narrative around how this was relevant to their organization. So they had a lot of pushback from their product teams who said, well, hang on a minute, this is not part of who we are. This is going to reduce quality. This is, this is not playing into the perception we want to build. And in fact, there was probably a really powerful story they could have told around how recycled materials could enhance what they were doing. And by missing that, it kind of trickled up to leadership, and it wasn't brought forward as a project.
So it's also thinking beyond the sustainability thing, like Maddy, you were saying how these initiatives can come from sustainability teams, but you need that wider team buy-in as well.
Yeah, totally.
So what are the solutions to that, Maddy? What did you discover?
So, I mean, as we alluded to in the example, I mean, anchoring your business model objectives to the core objectives of your business, finding that hook. And you might find that that's different for every team, right? You may even find that you don't need to use the term circular economy or circular business model. So many, powerful pieces of identity that businesses have, you can link to circularity anyway. We have a really good example of this. I mean, Arc'teryx is always been about durability. And we see that, you know, their angle on circular business models, it talks very much to that, right? They're using their existing identity and they're linking it to their core strategy. And that's what we need to sort of see more businesses doing. That also links to, you know, targets and KPIs of each team. If you're not pushing in the same direction for common goals, then, you know, we know that's going to be a huge problem. So again, we'll talk more to working with other teams and partners in the last episode, but that's a really crucial part. And I think lastly, it's finding the right language to use. As I said at the beginning, you don't always need to use the term circular economy, but I think there's some really compelling and exciting ways to talk about circularity. Accenture did a brilliant piece of work called Our Human Moment, which really speaks to the way that circular experiences really resonate with people. And, you know, that piece of work was about customers, but I think it can be applied really brilliantly internally in an organization as well, as a way to think about how to talk to different team members in different parts of the organization and make sure that you're speaking the right language for them.
Thanks, Maddy. Thanks, Ella. That was cluster number 1, which was thinking too small. So we heard about the lacking a plan for scale from the outset and the missing link to core business objectives. We've got 3 more clusters to come over the next 3 episodes. Ella, what's next?
Next up, we'll be talking about strategic misalignment and then going into narrow business cases and going it alone.
Fantastic. Well, if you can't wait till then, you can explore the paper we've been discussing. We'll put a link in the show notes. But if you enjoyed this episode, leave a review and come back next time. We'll see you then.